A black woman had just taken her seat in the priority section of a flight, a hard-earned reward after years of dedication and success. But moments later, everything changed. A flight attendant approached, her tone sharp and her gaze doubtful. "Excuse me, ma'am, this is a first-class seat. Are you sure this is your ticket?" The woman calmly handed over her boarding pass, showing her rightful place, but the attendant didn't relent. Instead, her questions grew louder, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. The humiliation was palpable. But what happened next? 7 minutes later, the airline's executive manager stepped in, reviewed the situation, and made a decision that no one expected. The attendant was fired on the spot. What followed shocked everyone. The incident sparked a wave of conversation across social media and beyond, igniting discussions about equality, bias, and standing up for what's right. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story moves you. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. The airport was no different than the countless others Naomi Carter had passed through, bright with the hum of fluorescent lights, polished tile floors reflecting hurried feet, and the low drone of travel announcements slicing through the restless chatter. But airports, as Naomi had learned, were more than just waystations for planes and luggage. They were theaters, stages where the subtle drama of everyday life played out with sharp clarity. And for some, they were battlegrounds. Naomi had packed light. A single carry-on rolled quietly behind her, its wheels whispering against the floor. Her heels clicked softly. Not hurried but purposeful. She had long learned that to move too quickly drew eyes, but to linger invited questions. The fine line between ease and expectation was one she had mastered over the years. Gate 14 stood ahead, its digital sign flashing the upcoming flight in silent certainty. Naomi tightened her grip on her boarding pass. The priority, printed at the top in bold letters she had earned. She wasn't the type to splurge on luxury. But this ticket, this small piece of comfort, was her indulgence. It was not simply about the larger seat or the early boarding, it was a symbol. A quiet declaration to herself that she had arrived, that the years of climbing uphill had meant something. But as she approached the line, that quiet sense of pride gave way to the faintest ripple of doubt. It started small, just a flicker, a glance from the couple behind her, the brief narrowing of eyes, as if to say, "Are you sure you belong here?" Naomi told herself she imagined it. Patricia Miller stood at the gate podium, greeting passengers with the rehearsed warmth of someone who could switch it off as easily as flicking a light. Naomi watched her smile stretch effortlessly for the man ahead, gray-haired, dressed in cargo shorts and a worn polo. The type of traveler who could wander into the priority line and not be questioned. "Enjoy your flight," Patricia chirped, waving him through with the practiced ease of someone unbothered. Naomi stepped forward, offering her ticket. She was met not with the same smile, but something harder to define, a pause. Almost imperceptible, but Naomi caught it. The way Patricia's eyes drifted from her ticket to her face, skimming her features as though trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't quite fit. It was a small thing. A flick of the eye. A shift in posture. Nothing you could call out. Nothing loud. But Naomi had long learned that racism rarely arrived in broad daylight. More often, it slipped in quietly, wearing the soft-soled shoes of polite doubt. "Ticket, please," Patricia said, already holding it. The scanner's silence, when it came, was louder than Naomi expected. Patricia pressed the ticket again. The machine stared back blankly. Naomi's heart did not race. Not yet, but she felt the first curl of tension tighten at the back of her neck. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. The kind of expression people made when confirming what they already suspected. "It's not scanning." Naomi shifted her weight slightly, keeping her voice level. "Might be the scanner. Happens sometimes." Patricia's eyes flicked back up. There was something there, just a flash. But Naomi caught it. A look Naomi knew too well. Or maybe it's not the scanner. It said. She wasn't angry. Not yet. Naomi had spent too many years, in too many rooms, with too many people who wore that same look. There was a kind of exhaustion that settled in your bones after a lifetime of proving you belonged. Patricia held the ticket a moment longer, as though feeling its weight. Then, with exaggerated care, she scanned it a third time. Nothing. Now the murmurs began quiet. Behind Naomi, but close enough to feel. She didn't turn. But she heard the man 2 rows back whisper to his wife. "Maybe she's in the wrong line," he said. Naomi didn't flinch, but Patricia's head tilted slightly, as if she had heard it too. She leaned closer to the scanner. The movement unhurried, almost indulgent. "It's not uncommon," Patricia offered, louder now, clearly addressing more than Naomi. "Sometimes passengers think they have priority when they don't." Naomi's chest tightened. "I have priority," Naomi said. Simple, direct. Patricia's smile returned, colder now, edged with the faintest shimmer of disbelief. "Of course," she said lightly, sliding the ticket back toward Naomi. "But let's double-check, just in case." The couple behind Naomi shifted closer. She could feel them watching, the weight of their gazes pressing against her back. Naomi didn't move. She pulled her phone from her bag and held it out, the confirmation screen glowing in her hand. "I don't think that will be necessary," Naomi said calmly, locking eyes with Patricia. Patricia hesitated. The dance had begun, the unspoken push and pull. But before Patricia could respond, a voice from the crowd interrupted, low and steady, cutting through the haze. "Is there a problem?" Naomi turned slightly, just enough to catch sight of the man who had spoken. Tall, casually dressed, his dark eyes fixed on Patricia with quiet intensity. "No problem," Patricia said quickly, though the stiffness in her posture betrayed her. The man held Patricia's gaze a second longer. Then his eyes flicked to Naomi. Just for a moment, Naomi's heart slowed. No one had said anything more. No raised voices, no confrontation. But Naomi felt that the balance had shifted. As Patricia reluctantly scanned the ticket again, Naomi let out the breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The machine beeped softly. Green. She stepped forward without another word. Her ticket returned without apology. But as Naomi walked toward the jet bridge, she knew the fight hadn't ended. It never did. The sound that followed Naomi Carter down the jet bridge wasn't the soft hum of engines or the distant crackle of announcements, it was the weight of silence. A silence that carried the unspoken things people thought but never said aloud. It trailed behind her like a second shadow, one she knew too well. She stepped onto the plane, her ticket now crumpled slightly in her hand. Naomi smoothed it out with slow precision, taking in the rows of seats, the sterile blue-gray of the cabin, and the polite half-smiles of the flight attendants who greeted her with professional detachment. She wasn't late, she wasn't causing a scene. And yet, the stares lingered. Naomi made her way down the narrow aisle toward the priority section. And with each step, she felt the subtle tension, like someone tuning a string just tight enough that the faintest touch might snap it. A woman in the aisle seat of her row, middle-aged, fair-skinned, with the neatness of someone who believed in doing things properly, glanced up as Naomi approached. Her eyes drifted, flicking to the empty seat by the window. Naomi's seat. The woman shifted ever so slightly, the small movement speaking louder than words. Naomi caught it in the way the woman tucked her purse closer to her lap, as if Naomi's very presence might be an intrusion. "Excuse me," Naomi said with measured calm. The woman hesitated for a half-second longer than she should have, then forced a tight smile and rose from her seat. "Of course," she murmured, her voice thin with surprise. Naomi slid into the window seat, pressing herself lightly against the curve of the fuselage, as if she could shrink away from the weight of the unspoken. As the woman resettled beside her, Naomi could feel the stiffness between them, the carefully curated space that had nothing to do with armrests and legroom. Naomi kept her eyes on the window, watching the runway shimmer in the late afternoon sun. But the feeling didn't leave. It sat there, lingering, the kind of thing you couldn't point to, couldn't prove, the kind of thing that left you questioning whether you imagined it at all. It wasn't the grand, sweeping moments of hatred Naomi had learned to brace for, it was the accumulation of small betrayals. The glance, the pause, the quiet doubts that lived behind the thin walls of polite society. These were the moments that wore at you, that carved at the edges of your patience until even your silence began to feel like surrender. The pilot's voice crackled over the speaker, and the attendants moved to secure the cabin for takeoff. Naomi felt the plane shift beneath her, the slight rumble as it taxied toward the runway. Just as she allowed herself a breath, Patricia Miller appeared. Naomi saw her coming before she spoke. The blonde hair, the clipped walk. Patricia moved with the kind of authority that came not from power but from assumption. She leaned slightly over the woman in the aisle seat, her eyes fixed squarely on Naomi. "I'm sorry," Patricia said, though there was no apology in her tone. "I need to verify your ticket one more time." Naomi blinked, the words settling over her like cold steel. The woman beside her shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to notice the exchange happening inches away. Naomi's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing at first. She wanted to ask why. Wanted to know what made Patricia so sure that she out of every passenger in the section required further scrutiny. But she didn't ask, because she already knew the answer. Without a word, Naomi held out the crumpled boarding pass. Patricia took it carefully, holding it as though the paper itself needed to be questioned. She pressed her lips together as her eyes flicked across the print. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Finally, Patricia returned the ticket. "Thank you," she said, her voice light but distant. She walked away without further explanation. Naomi let the pass rest in her lap, smoothing it out for the second time. The woman beside her said nothing. No one did. And that, Naomi thought, was the heart of the thing. It was never just about the gate agent. It was about the silence that followed. The passengers who saw, who heard, and who let it drift by like it was no more important than the closing of an overhead bin. Naomi shifted her gaze back to the window, watching the airport shrink beneath them as the plane lifted into the sky. The quiet stretched, but this time, Naomi let it sit. She would not explain herself. She would not apologize for the space she occupied. And as the plane ascended, she held that thought tightly like armor. Naomi Carter kept her eyes on the window as the plane cut through clouds, the ground below shrinking into a patchwork of roads and rivers. The sun dipped lower, staining the sky amber, but Naomi's reflection in the glass was clear, steady, unmoving. She thought she had left the weight of the terminal behind, but it sat with her still. It lingered in the stiffness of her shoulders, the way her breath slowed to match the pulse of the engine. She had been here before, this place where silence screamed louder than any accusation, where suspicion disguised itself as protocol. The woman next to her hadn't spoken a word since Patricia's interruption. Naomi could feel her presence in the careful way she folded her hands over the blanket, the way her elbow stopped just shy of the armrest between them. These were quiet negotiations, invisible lines that people like Naomi had learned to navigate without complaint. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane reached cruising altitude. Naomi closed her eyes, not to sleep but to shut out the world beyond her eyelids, the murmurs, the glances, the lingering echoes of Patricia's voice. But peace, Naomi knew, was never given freely. Somewhere behind her, a conversation drifted forward, low, almost hushed, but the words carried just enough weight to reach Naomi's ears. "You saw how she reacted. I'm not saying it's fake. But," a man's voice, confident, a little too loud for someone pretending not to be overheard. "Well, you know how it is." Another voice replied, softer but complicit. "People always find a way to get into these seats." Naomi's eyes opened slowly. Her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon outside, but her focus narrowed to the row behind her. There it was, the casual unraveling of someone's dignity. A conversation she wasn't meant to hear but was expected to endure. She wanted to turn, to face them, to strip their words bare and watch the shame flicker across their faces. But she stayed still. She had played this game long enough to know its rules. The moment she responded, she would become the problem. A steward passed by, pausing just long enough to refill Naomi's glass with water. "Excuse me," Naomi said softly, stopping him with the ease of someone accustomed to polite confrontation. The steward, a young man with the nervousness of newness, met her gaze. "Yes, ma'am? Could you let the gentleman in row 12 know?" she began, her voice calm but deliberate. "That their voices carry further than they realize?" His eyes flickered, uncertain. "I'm sure it's nothing," Naomi added, her tone light enough to disarm but sharp enough to cut. He hesitated but nodded, offering a quiet, "Of course," before disappearing down the aisle. Naomi didn't turn to see the reaction. She didn't need to. The sudden hush behind her was answer enough. But the quiet that followed wasn't victory. Because Naomi knew the truth, those men wouldn't remember this moment by the time the plane landed. They would forget her face before they reached baggage claim. But Naomi would remember. She would carry it with her, the way she carried every other encounter like this. It would live alongside the moment Patricia had questioned her ticket. just as it lived with the countless small humiliations that had come before it. Naomi glanced at her reflection once more, her own eyes meeting hers in the darkened glass. It wasn't rage she felt, nor even sadness. It was something deeper, weariness, sharpened by the quiet certainty that tomorrow would bring more of the same. She could endure it, but why should she have to? The seatbelt light flickered on, signaling the plane's descent. Naomi sat straighter, rolling her shoulders back. No, she thought, not this time. The seatbelt sign glowed above Naomi Carter's head, but the tension pressing against her chest had nothing to do with altitude. The plane had begun its slow descent, sinking through layers of thin, pale clouds. The sky outside her window stretched wide and indifferent, but inside the cabin, the walls felt closer, air thicker somehow. Naomi let out a quiet breath and adjusted her posture, though the discomfort running along her spine had nothing to do with the seat. It was the weight of the eyes she couldn't see but could still feel. Road 12 had been silent for the past 20 minutes. Too silent. The kind of quiet that meant the men behind her were waiting, listening for any sign that Naomi might say more, or worse, that she might say nothing at all. She could feel it, the delicate truce that hung in the air. The woman beside Naomi shifted, tucking the airline blanket tighter around her waist. The movement was small, but Naomi caught the nervous glance, the fleeting flicker of unease. It was the same look Naomi had seen in stores when she stepped too close to the jewelry counter. The same hesitation in the eyes of hotel clerks as they asked, "Are you sure this is the right room?" The woman wasn't afraid of Naomi. Not really. She was afraid of what Naomi's discomfort would mean for her. Naomi stayed quiet. She had seen this dance before. White discomfort demanded silence, and black survival often required it. But Naomi was growing tired of being quiet. The flight attendant's voice cut through the hum of the engine. Light and pleasant. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seat backs and tray tables are in the upright position." The woman beside Naomi fumbled to adjust her seat, her gaze flicking toward Naomi in apology as if to say, "See, I'm following the rules." Naomi didn't flinch. A small part of her wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. The way respectability wrapped itself around people like armor, as if keeping their heads down would shield them from the coldness of the world. It never did. The plane dipped lower, the ground below coming into view, slabs of highways and office parks cutting through stretches of land. Cars glinting faintly in the late afternoon light. Naomi found herself wondering what stories those roads carried. How many times had someone like her been stopped by flashing lights for driving a little too nice of a car down those same highways? How many store clerks had followed a black teenager through the parking lot, certain something had been stolen simply because nothing looked out of place? It wasn't about the plane anymore. It never had been. The hum of the engine, the cramped rows of seats, the forced politeness of strangers, it was just a reflection of the world Naomi lived in every day. A world that asked her, over and over, "Who are you to be here?" The tires kissed the runway, the soft jolt of landing pulling Naomi back into the present. The woman beside her exhaled louder than necessary. A sigh of relief, perhaps, or maybe just the sound of someone glad to leave behind the quiet tension that had filled the air between them. Naomi unbuckled her seatbelt but didn't rise. She watched the passengers ahead, moving quickly to gather their bags, already reaching for overhead compartments before the plane had fully stopped. She could wait. She had done enough chasing in her lifetime. As the aisle crowded, Naomi felt the weight return, the low buzz of murmurs behind her, the sharp intake of breath from row 12. "Look, all I'm saying is, she made a big deal over nothing," one of the men whispered. Not quite quiet enough. Naomi's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. The woman beside her shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Naomi could have let it pass, but she didn't. She turned slowly, catching the eyes of the man behind her, a middle-aged, heavy-set man with the sunburnt complexion of someone unused to being questioned. "Excuse me?" Naomi's voice was soft, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. His lips parted slightly, and for a fleeting moment, he looked around, as if searching for someone else Naomi might be speaking to. But she wasn't. "You said I made a big deal over nothing?" Naomi asked, tilting her head. The man swallowed, his eyes darting to the seatbelt sign as if hoping it might save him. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. It's just, well, you know how these things are." He gestured vaguely. But the movement lacked conviction. Naomi held his gaze, unblinking. "No," she said, her voice low enough that only the few surrounding rows could hear. "I don't know how these things are. Why don't you explain it to me?" The man shifted, his discomfort radiating like heat. The other passengers fell silent, suddenly interested in fastening their jackets and adjusting their bags. He opened his mouth, but no words came. That was the thing about people like him. They wanted to be heard but never questioned. "I'll wait," Naomi added, her tone unrelenting. The man shook his head quickly. "Forget it," he muttered, breaking eye contact as he turned away. Naomi didn't press further. She didn't need to. The silence that followed her down the aisle spoke louder than anything he could have said. As Naomi stepped onto the jet bridge, she inhaled deeply, letting the cool air wash over her. Another small battle fought, another scar added to the collection. But Naomi knew the truth. This wasn't about one plane ride. It was about the next one, and the one after that. And maybe, just maybe, the people watching in silence today would remember her voice the next time they found themselves at 35,000 feet. The airport terminal stretched long and cold, humming with the restless energy of travelers eager to be anywhere but here. Naomi Carter sat in one of the stiff chairs by the window, her bag tucked neatly by her feet. Outside, the runway shimmered under the evening sun, planes tilting skyward one by one. It should have been over. She should have been heading toward her hotel, slipping quietly into a cab like everyone else. But Naomi had learned that racism did not end at the gate. Nor did it dissolve once the plane touched down. It lingered, waiting for the next opening, the next moment of doubt to creep in. "A delay," they said. "Technical issue." The pilot's voice had been calm, almost apologetic. As the flight was rerouted, passengers were shuffled to a new gate, told to wait for further instructions. Naomi had felt the weight of the collective groan ripple through the crowd. The man from row 12 sat across the terminal, his back to her now. He wasn't alone, another man had joined him. The two locked in quiet conversation. Occasionally, one of them would glance in Naomi's direction, but not for long. She didn't look away. Naomi didn't believe in shrinking. A flight attendant passed by, heels clicking against the tile. Naomi caught her eye, recognizing the same woman who had watched Patricia question her ticket hours earlier. "Excuse me," Naomi called gently. The woman stopped, offering a hesitant smile. "Yes, ma'am? Is there any update on boarding?" Naomi asked, though she already knew the answer. "Not yet, but it shouldn't be too long." Naomi studied her for a moment, searching the attendant's face for signs of discomfort. The woman's eyes flickered nervously to the side, toward the men across the room, before settling back on Naomi. "If you need anything," the flight attendant added quickly, "just let me know." "I will," Naomi said, though she doubted it would make a difference. The woman nodded, retreating toward the gate. Naomi leaned back in her seat. The terminal began to fill with the heavy quiet of waiting. Children squirmed in their parents' laps. Businessmen scrolled through emails, and couples whispered in soft, tired tones. But underneath it all, Naomi could feel the rhythm of something else, the unspoken tension that pulsed through the room. It wasn't just the delay. It was the way people avoided looking directly at her. The way eyes lingered too long or not at all. Naomi was used to being the only black woman in a room. She was used to the polite smiles, the shifting glances, the slow, crawling realization that she was an outsider in spaces others moved through effortlessly. But tonight, it felt heavier. Across the room, the man from row 12 leaned toward his friend, whispering something that made the other man laugh under his breath. Naomi didn't need to hear the words to know they were about her. She could feel it like a hand pressed against her back, nudging her toward confrontation. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. This was the part no one ever talked about. It wasn't the loud, violent moments that exhausted her, it was this. The small cuts, the ones that happened beneath the surface, invisible to anyone who hadn't lived them. It was the way she had to measure a response, knowing that any sudden movement, any shift in tone, could turn her from victim to aggressor in the eyes of the crowd. Naomi's phone buzzed softly in her lap, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from Daniel Hayes. "I'm at the airport. Where are you?" Her fingers hovered over the screen. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. She wasn't sure she had the energy for another conversation. But something about Daniel, his calm authority, the way he had stepped in without hesitation, made her reconsider. Gate 27, she typed. 5 minutes later, Daniel appeared, his tall frame cutting through the crowd. He approached with the kind of ease that suggested he belonged here. The weight of his title shielding him from the invisible lines Naomi so often stumbled against. "Ms. Carter," he greeted, taking the seat beside her. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet urgency behind it. "Mr. Hayes, I heard about the delay," he said. "I figured I'd check in." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "I didn't realize CEOs handled flight delays now." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Only when necessary." Naomi glanced toward the men across the terminal. One of them had noticed Daniel's arrival and quickly nudged his companion. The two suddenly engrossed in their phones. Daniel followed her gaze but said nothing. After a moment, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I spoke to Patricia," he said quietly. Naomi's jaw tightened. "I wanted to make sure she understood exactly why she was removed from the gate." Daniel continued. "It wasn't just about the ticket." Naomi didn't respond. Daniel exhaled, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I know an apology doesn't undo any of it, but I need you to know that I'm not letting it slide." Naomi let the words settle between them, weighing them carefully. "Good," she said finally. Daniel nodded, leaning back in his chair. The silence that followed felt less heavy somehow. Across the room, the gate agent's voice crackled to life, announcing that boarding would resume shortly. Passengers began gathering their things, rising from their seats with renewed urgency. Naomi stayed seated, watching as the two men from row 12 stood, avoiding her gaze as they filed into the line. Daniel glanced at her. "Do you want to board early?" Naomi shook her head. "I'll wait." She wasn't in a hurry. Some things were worth waiting for. The line at gate 27 shifted forward in sluggish increments, a weary procession of bodies leaning into the weight of travel. Naomi Carter watched from her seat, her fingers tracing slow circles along the worn leather strap of her bag. Daniel Hayes sat beside her, his presence a quiet buffer against the current of unspoken things that drifted between her and the rest of the room. Across the terminal, the two men from row 12 stood just far enough away to make their avoidance obvious. One glanced toward Naomi, his eyes skimming over her as if she were a detail on the periphery acknowledged. But only barely. Naomi had seen that look before. It wasn't the outright hostility that left bruises on the skin. No, this was more subtle, the kind of disregard that left bruises beneath it, in the soft, hidden places no one could point to but carried just the same. Daniel shifted slightly, as if sensing the weight in the air. "You know," he said, his voice low, "sometimes I think airports are like small reflections of the world. Compressed, but clearer." Naomi smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Compressed is one way to put it." "It's strange," Daniel continued, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the crowd. "We all buy the same ticket, follow the same rules, but somehow, some of us are always asked to prove we belong." Naomi glanced at him. There was something in his tone, a softness, but also frustration, the kind that came from someone who had walked just enough of the same roads to know their unevenness. "Funny how that works," Naomi replied. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes lingered on the men at the far end of the terminal. He saw them too, the way they leaned into each other. Their voices hushed but not quite quiet enough. "They won't remember this," Naomi said, almost to herself. "By the time they land, it'll just be another flight. But I'll carry it." Daniel's expression darkened slightly, but he said nothing. There was nothing to say. Really, the truth of it lay there between them, bare and unmovable. A soft chime echoed overhead, signaling final boarding. The line thinned as the last few passengers shuffled toward the gate. Naomi watched the men disappear down the jet bridge, their laughter trailing behind them like smoke. Daniel stood, motioning toward the gate with a slight nod. "Let's get you on board." Naomi hesitated for just a moment before rising. Her steps felt deliberate, each one pressing into the ground with a weight she refused to apologize for. As they approached the gate, the young flight attendant from earlier reappeared. Her eyes flickered to Daniel, first recognizing the quiet authority he carried before settling on Naomi. "Welcome back, Ms. Carter," the attendant said softly, her smile a little more genuine this time. Naomi nodded in return. The short walk down the jet bridge felt heavier than it should have. Naomi could hear the faint hum of engines growing louder. But the sound only seemed to amplify the quiet storm brewing in her chest. By the time she stepped onto the plane, the two men from row 12 were already seated, their heads bent over their phones. Naomi paused for just a second, long enough for one of them to glance up and meet her gaze. She didn't look away. The man's eyes flickered with something that almost resembled discomfort before he dropped his gaze back to his screen. Naomi smiled faintly, not out of satisfaction, but out of something quieter, steadier. She took her seat by the window, the leather cool beneath her fingertips. Daniel passed by, nodding once before disappearing into the first-class cabin. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its slow taxi down the runway, Naomi let her gaze drift to the horizon beyond the glass. There were no grand victories here, no raised voices or dramatic confrontations. Just the steady, quiet defiance of being exactly where she belonged. And sometimes, Naomi thought, that was enough. The plane rose steadily, piercing the clouds with a grace that felt at odds with the weight Naomi Carter carried in her chest. Below, the world unraveled in tiny threads, roads shrinking to veins, houses nothing more than specks scattered across a quilt of green and brown. Naomi pressed her forehead lightly against the window, letting the cool glass ground her. There was something comforting about the sky, how it stretched endlessly without boundary or question. Up here, there were no gates to block her path, no sideways glances to shrink her spirit. But even at 30,000 feet, the ground had a way of pulling at her heels. Behind her, she could still feel them, the two men from row 12. Their voices had grown quieter, their laughter subdued, but Naomi knew better than to mistake silence for peace. The thing about racism, she thought, was that it never needed an invitation. It didn't arrive with the crash of fists or the glare of hatred, not always. More often, it slipped in like fog under a door, hanging in the air just long enough to choke you before anyone else noticed it was there. Naomi shifted in her seat, exhaling slowly. It wasn't anger she felt. Not exactly. Anger, at least, burned hot and fast. What she felt now was colder, older. A weariness that settled deep, curling its fingers around the quiet corners of her heart. The flight attendant appeared again, moving down the aisle with the soft efficiency of someone trained to blend into the background. As she reached Naomi's row, she paused, her eyes flickering with a kind of hesitance Naomi could only describe as pity. "Ms. Carter," the attendant said softly, leaning in, "would you like something to drink?" Naomi considered it, but she wasn't thirsty. "No, thank you," she replied, offering a polite but distant smile. The attendant nodded, retreating down the aisle. Naomi watched her go, noting the way her posture stiffened as she passed by the men in row 12. Naomi could feel their eyes drifting lazily over the attendant before settling back on their screens. Uninterested. It wasn't just Naomi they looked at that way. That was the thing about men like them. Their gaze didn't discriminate, but their respect did. Naomi leaned back in her seat, letting the hum of the engines fill the space where words should have been. She thought about Daniel Hayes, how he had appeared beside her at the terminal, how effortlessly he had turned the tide with nothing more than presence and power. It had taken a man in his position to shift the balance, to make those men rethink their snide remarks, even if only for a moment. And that, Naomi thought bitterly, was the heart of the problem. Justice, in her experience, was often dictated by proximity to power. And for people like her, that power was rarely close enough to touch. Her eyes drifted back to the window, to the world below that felt so distant now. Naomi wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't the last time she would sit in a room where her presence would be questioned. It wasn't the last time someone would mistake her confidence for arrogance, her silence for complacency. But she also knew this. She didn't need Daniel Hayes to step in every time. She wouldn't let the comfort of his authority replace the fire in her own voice. The plane leveled off, and Naomi let out a slow breath, watching as the sky stretched endlessly in all directions. She was exactly where she belonged. And no one, no gate agent, no seatmate, no stranger's gaze could tell her otherwise. The plane descended through thick clouds, the sky darkening as dusk wrapped around the horizon. Naomi Carter felt the shift, the slow pull of gravity as the aircraft lowered itself back toward the earth. She adjusted in her seat, steadying herself for the return. A soft chime echoed overhead. The captain's voice followed, warm and detached, thanking the passengers for their patience. But Naomi knew better. Patience was never freely given. It was demanded, drawn from people like her, piece by piece, until it hardened into something else entirely. She glanced around the cabin. The faces were familiar by now. The young couple 2 rows up. The man with the briefcase who hadn't stopped typing since takeoff. And of course, the 2 men from row 12. They had grown quieter as the flight wore on, shrinking into their seats as if hoping Naomi would forget their existence. But Naomi didn't forget. She had long accepted that racism didn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it came wrapped in the ordinary, in the hum of engines, the dull stretch of a waiting room, or the space between 2 rows of seats. The plane tilted slightly as it prepared for final descent. Naomi's hand tightened around the armrest, not out of fear but reflex. The way one holds themselves together when the weight of the world feels heavier than usual. Beside her, the woman in the aisle seat shifted nervously. Naomi felt the edge of her glance but didn't return it. There it was again, that quiet discomfort. The woman wasn't afraid of Naomi. She was afraid of proximity to Naomi's experience. Afraid that even sitting next to her might invite the same scrutiny. Naomi let out a slow breath. The plane dipped lower. The runway lights shimmered in the distance like faint stars, guiding them home. As the wheels touched down with a soft jolt, Naomi watched the terminal lights blur past the window. For a brief moment, she wondered if things might be different when they landed, if somehow the weight she carried might lift. If the strangers beside her might see her as more than just a quiet question mark. But the moment passed, and Naomi knew the truth. The world didn't change in a single landing. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Naomi gathered her things with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this countless times before. The overhead lights flickered on, bathing the cabin in a soft, artificial glow. The men from row 12 were already on their feet, shuffling toward the aisle, eager to leave. One of them glanced briefly in Naomi's direction, his eyes darting away the moment she looked back. She didn't flinch. Naomi remained seated, letting the crowd thin before standing. She felt Daniel Hayes' presence before she saw him waiting near the front of the cabin. His gaze steady and unreadable. "Miss Carter," he greeted as she approached. "Mr. Hayes." There was no need for more. His presence alone was acknowledgement enough. As they stepped into the terminal, Naomi felt the eyes again, soft, lingering, watching, but this time, she held her head higher. The men from row 12 were already disappearing into the crowd, their laughter echoing faintly in the distance. Naomi let them go. Her battle wasn't with them, not anymore. Daniel walked beside her in silence. Only when they reached the baggage claim did he finally speak. "You handled that well," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Naomi paused, her eyes scanning the carousel as bags began to tumble onto the belt. "I shouldn't have to handle it at all," she replied. Daniel nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling between them. "You're right," he said, "and I'm working on that." Naomi turned to face him fully, her gaze unwavering. "Work faster." For a moment, Daniel held her stare, and then, with the faintest of smiles, he nodded. Naomi's bag appeared, gliding toward her like a familiar companion. She reached for it, her grip firm, and stepped away from the carousel without hesitation. As she walked toward the exit, the cool air of the terminal washed over her, but the weight on her shoulders remained. Naomi had long understood that justice wasn't found in grand gestures or polished apologies. It lived in the quiet, stubborn defiance of existing fully in spaces that tried to shrink her. And as she stepped outside, the city lights flickering in the distance, Naomi knew she would continue to carry that defiance with her, one flight, one gate, one landing at a time.